everyone, and welcome to another episode where we're going to be talking specifically about metrics. Yes, we love metrics. We love to measure things. Everyone loves metrics in the open source space. We are a metrics fan, of course. And as we've talked to different guests on the Hacking Open Source Business podcast, they've had different views on metrics. In fact, not everything can be measured. Talking to an investor like JJ over at OSS Capital, we were able to hear from him why humans are difficult to sometimes express in metrics. Let's take a listen.
Humans tend to be these like squishy, very difficult to express in mathematical terms, kind of beings that you really have to get to know, and you have to kind of understand like motivations, drives, aspirations, inclinations, sort of personality traits. Are you predisposed in a certain way or not? So like that's just really just human relationship development and understanding. If we have investing really, and I've been doing it full time for 4 years. It's not really that long. In venture capital, private equity investing in very early stage companies, you typically have like 7 to 10 year feedback cycles to just know if you were kind of right, not exactly right, and you're never perfectly right either. You're never perfectly right. You're only partially right. So like for example, you can invest in a company and they could become, you invested at $100 million valuation and then they could become a $20 billion company. You're not perfectly right. You're only partially right, because that company, fast forward 5 years further, could have been a $0 billion company, and they were just a $20 billion company because some strategic bought them for that out of fear that they were going to disrupt their core business. But had they not continued to innovate, maybe they would have died. And so like you were only right on a temporal dimension at a certain point in time, given certain execution up to that point in time. This is like why there's like so many false positives in private startups and this tech ecosystem in general, is people just think that like things are kind of consistently exponentially linear and they continue going forever if things continue to grow. And the reality is you could have these like false starts that kind of like wane off and sort of flash in the pan dynamic where something kind of appears to be working but can't be sustained over a long period of time for a variety of different reasons that are very case specific.
Now, we can't talk about metrics without looking at the commercial aspects of metrics either. And so now let's listen to some of our guests talk about how they view metrics from a sales, marketing, and a business perspective when it comes to open source.
I mean, there's a lot of metrics, I think. There's definitely a lot of metrics. We also definitely look at search a lot. What are people like looking for? Because that's a lot of our traffic. They'll actually search for Mattermost by name. We definitely have digital channels that go out there, and we look at those channels as sort of top of the funnel metrics and show us. Of course, pipeline is super important. We're a lot of our audience is very privacy focused, so it's not like telemetry is going to be a huge part of us. We'll get some, and it'll be anonymized, and we have we actually are very explicit with our telemetry policy, and we tell people like this is why and this is what, and yeah, you can turn it off if you want. So it's a little bit more spotty there, and then we're going to be more focused on probably like the customers that are in pipe, which take a while, right? So they're going to be like, hey, I'm interested. I probably have a free deployment. We need to move it through like these security checklists, this MSA negotiation, this internal committee, and then it sort of goes there. So I think the pipeline. So I'd say like top of the funnel, you're looking for search and website, digital body language. Then you've got then really about like, are they sort of engaged with us? Because we kind of go through a dark piece where they're just like using us with telemetry off, and then they'll pop up sort of in the sort of leads, sales accepted leads, MQLs, piped opportunities, and moving through the process.
This is one of the cases where honestly we don't believe that being accurate is the right answer here, and we kind of assume that that what we do know is a representative of the larger audience. So whatever data that we do get, we kind of ensure that hey, that data is actually working for us. So if we have, let's say 100 people in the community and maybe only like 5 or 10 decide to share data with us and say this is what apps I'm building, and this I'm kind of sticking around, we kind of use that as a good proxy to understand like how our engagement with these developers is working. But we also track things like the developers in our community, do they consistently engage with us on Discord? So our most active Discord members, are they continuing to be active? Are they continuing to build? Do they keep asking more questions? Do they keep contributing and helping not only us, but also helping other new community members actually get onboarded with their applications. So that's one thing that we looked at. We looked at obviously product metrics of whether people were actually getting to their first successful application and whether they were sticking around with building more applications, going forward. We looked at stuff like that. We looked at our engagement on our events, whether people were joining those events, whether they continue to engage with us on our community calls and our other user education efforts. So we use things like that to really understand, and also of course the type of support queries that we would get. We'd look at whether users were struggling with the basics of getting set up and app building, or were we getting more queries around advanced concepts of how do I scale my applications, how do I build more applications faster, and how do I really make my applications look incredible. So that kind of gave us a good sense of where these developers were in their entire journey, whether they were all at the beginning of the funnel or were they like more towards the end and being like solidly retained. And a mix of these gave us a good idea.
I think at the end of the day is we definitely have quite a lot of learning curve there. At the end of the day, we have to find what is the most effective channel. We tried at the beginning, I think community is definitely the channel. And in the middle, I think we still kind of try a bunch of different things, but at the end of that, what we found is community is still the most effective channel for open source business. So the way how I'm looking into the metric is obviously the ARR is in the current economy that the founders, executive, the investor, the board that need to looking into, but at the same time is what drives the ARR is how large is your community and how many people is using this technology and how we can convert these open source users to I would say paying customers. So that's the I would say that's the foundation. And so meaning how large of the community, I think Matt, we have a lot of conversation with Matt in terms of how we want to measure the community metrics. But at the end of the day, I think it will become people. So people meaning either you are contributors, that is how many people you're contributing there. Users, how many users that are using open source Pulsar. The other one is I would say influencer. They are not directing using Pulsar, but they might writing articles. They might be patient about these like Pulsar. So those are kind of two different metrics that I was looking into the community, and that would determine how large the community we can go, and then that would determine what is the cap of our entire business can go.
Yeah, I think on a metrics, in the context of metrics and how long is a sales cycle and how you think about it, I think it's really about segmentation. The same way that a small medium business cycle is going to be a lot shorter usually than an enterprise cycle with a lot less sort of variability. I think the same way with open core, right? It's always about segmenting the different audiences. Some are just going to be like free forever. They're sort of like, nope, we're open source hardcore. Like we'd rather fork your project and add the spit and glue and get all the features we need. And like, we never need to talk to you, but thank you very much. And we're fine with that, right? And then, and we're totally fine with that. There's wonderful customers out there that we spend time with that actually contribute back and are really great parts of the community, and they'll still have a certain take. But a lot of our what we call the ICP, the ideal customer profile, is going to be these enterprises who have these strict regulatory requirements, but still want to be productive. They want to reduce risk. They want to have control of their collaboration. They want to make everyone more efficient. And in that frame, they're always going to buy, right? Now, it's a question of when they're going to buy, but they're always going to buy as they scale. Because it's just their model. It's how they consume software. So in those spaces, it turns out to be, it's almost like the take a traditional sales cycle, but like kind of move it to the POC, and it's kind of around that stage. And you want to, and it's going to be very different in our sort of like federal business, versus our commercial business. It'll be very different for if it's a, so the variables are going to be, is it a large enterprise, or is it a small medium business, or somewhere in between? Is it a public sector or private sector business? And that'll determine budget cycles. And then it'll also determine sort of use case and culture. So we tend to do the best where if the managers are technical, like we're in, right? If the managers know how to code, they're technical or ex-technical, like that's our sweet spot. So there's, a lot of tech giants and wonderful companies out there that are in that sweet spot. There's another one which takes it a longer, but eventually gets there. It's organizations where the developers really like us, but the managers aren't technical and they don't understand why you need something like Mattermost when you have like, oh, there's Microsoft Teams, right? Like I can send emojis there. It's like I can send an Office document, and they're like, why can't you use? Yeah, it's like, oh, this works for me. Like, what's the difference? And then developers get frustrated, and all these, all this stuff ensues, and we might get run, and we actually do get run as shadow IT there much longer, in those organizations. So that's the kind of segmentation. There's sort of the sweet spot, or ideal customer profile, and that adoption curve, and those sort of the adoption curve and those characteristics are pretty consistent. And then there's going to be the outliers on both sides, like the free forevers, and then the sort of like a little bit less like it's more heterogeneous organizations.
Those three different metrics is actually changing over time. At the beginning, I think you really focus on contributor. As you move, you're probably looking into influencer. Then you're looking into users. So I think you probably care all three at different stage, but you put different weights at different stage. For example, at the beginning, we put a lot of efforts on the contributor, because that is the way how early adopters would using Pulsar, they use it, they contribute it, because the project is not perfect, it's still not mature enough, so you still need to fix bug. So like having contributor contributing, having those contributors talking about Pulsar, that is the way how you plant the seeds of the community and then going from there. But as you grow there, you probably don't need a lot of contributors, or you're looking more these users. So that means then how can you get people from not knowing about Pulsar towards writing the first application? That is the channel, that is the path that we need to shorten. And how to shorten that would be the community focus. Is that, are we going to optimize the documentation? Are we going to optimize the entire download, so that we can get people from doesn't know about Pulsar towards building the first application? Then this is the top funnel, and then once they build the first application, then how we can drive them to use more features there, then that is going through the rest of the I would say nurturing process, is to get people excited about more features, excited about kind of the a lot of benefits coming out of Pulsar, and then you are able to insert certain like interactions through your DevRel team, through your potential support team or account executive, to work with those people in that journey.
Now, if you are into the open source space and you're in the tech space, you might be in a DevRel role. And that means that maybe you don't have a direct connection to those business metrics, so you're looking at ways to measure how effective your content, how your contributions are to the ecosystem, and some of the developer-focused things you're doing. So let's listen to some experts on how they measure DevRel and how they measure those community things.
The most meaningful are mostly around engagement metrics, like how many people show up to an event, how many people engage with your content. I mean, because you're building content for people to use, you should measure that. Are they using it? And usually that helps a lot. Like, oh, this didn't quite hit, this one did. Okay, so this is what the community is interested in. Okay, we can make a choice there. Other metrics that I think are important are around the community, which is like how many community contributed articles are there? I mean, that is, without that, your community is going to die. It's just going to wither. And so we look at how many contributed articles there are, how many posted use cases, that sort of thing. Engagement levels there. So those are my two easy hot buckets. I mean, there's a lot of metrics inside those, but those are two that I think, without getting overwhelming with this data dump, I think those are really two that you should always consider. Always start out with the idea that everything you provide is without a transaction. So you're not asking, here, if I give you some education, you'll give me something. Never start with a transaction. You will get value from your community later on. Don't lose sight of that.
I hate metrics so much. Like, I think it doesn't make any sense. I think the reason why there's a metric conference at each DevRel conference is because it doesn't make any sense. That's why we are talking about this every single year, every time we are just, how do we do it? And it's just, the thing is, as a culture, as a an agent for change, your role is to make every other metrics better, every other team's metric better, because your role is to help every other team. That's why I help the field marketing team. That's what be more developer friendly. That's why I help the field engineering team. That's what we do. We make other people better by being more friendly with developers. That's our role, is to make other team better at talking to developers and at building those developer relations. So what metrics do you have? Well, you have the same metrics than everybody else. So you sort of have the CEO metrics, which is weird, and which is, of course, now it's been implemented at Couchbase because that wouldn't make any sense to the board. So we do have to come up with our own metric. So what is it? Good question. So that was just my personal opinion. Let's move that aside. We do, I guess, what most people do. We look at the growth of our community, and so we have several metrics. We use a wonderful platform called Common Room for that. Common Room, it's like a community CRM sort of, but that's much more intelligent than that. It allows us to have all the information we centralized about all our different presence on the internet or others, because you can embed your own metrics as well. So, Stack Overflow, Discord, our forums on Discourse, all those places. So we look at the growth of active users, because that's important. That's mostly community metrics. But again, if it's your metric, who's to say that it's your doing or the global marketing team's doing? And that's why I think, those metrics are really hard to do and hard to get right. You can really know, because again, your role is to make everybody else's metric better. If the whole company is aligned to be more developer friendly. If you're a small business inside a bigger business, then that's your metric, and that's a bit of a different story. So community-wise, we use that. On the DevRel side of things, on the evangelist side of things, anything that's powered by Couchbase is important to us. So we keep track on what is powered by Couchbase. It's mostly open source projects. We don't really know, what happens behind closed walls, but we track project being built and supporting Couchbase. If there's something new that supports Couchbase, that's great. We're happy. It's easier for us to use this as a metric because we are not first on the market, or we're not the default choice of people. So we have some room to grow, and we have a way to see line goes up, which might not necessarily be the case if you're Mongo or Postgres, because you're sort of the default choice. When someone builds something, usually they start by this one or the other. So we're not the default choice. We have to build this ourselves, or to wait for other people to build it. So we try to keep tab on what people do with Couchbase. That's super important, and that's what we want in the end. In the end, we want people to use Couchbase to do rad shit.
For me, it's not about I for sure track things like conversions, like how many people converting to free or paid tiers for my content, like number of hits and clicks and that sort of thing too. But I feel like the biggest thing for me is just output consistency, because I think I have a good hunch on what's going to do well or not do well. But at the end of the day, stuff I can't predict is going to do well and take off, and stuff that I think is going to do well, it's just absolute bombs. The key for me is just to make things consistently, and then tracking secondarily all of the performance metrics you'd expect around how engaging your content is or whatever.
I think the number one and the absolute number one thing that we live and die by inside Appsmith is our developer retention. That's pretty much the main thing that we really care about. And what this means is it's not about getting new developers. It's really just about making sure that every developer who checks out the product sticks around for the long run. And if they didn't, why did they stick around? What stopped them from actually using Appsmith? Because it's the kind of product that could pretty much help you in your everyday work. You could use it for a ton of things, whether it's your side hobby project or your actual work for internal tools, or even experimenting on something on a side business that you'd like. So we'd consistently keep asking that question, and we'd be obsessed with what is our developer retention, and how do we measure it, and how do we make sure that the developer retention gets better, and that would be like our core metric internally.
So when we talk metrics, we're not just talking about business sides of things. There's also metrics that come just from managing open source projects. Whether you're part of a foundation or you're a company that just uses open source, maybe you're an OSPO, there are metrics that people look at and try and track. And so we asked some of the experts in the space, again, what they look at from that more community perspective when they're not necessarily trying to commercialize their open source. Let's take a listen.
I always think about it, right, as a doctor, you're looking at height, weight, blood pressure, heart rate, all these like high level signals that can not necessarily give you diagnostic capability, but they can give you a sense of whether this person is doing well or not. And those metrics for me, like if I take the equivalent, right, my kind of immediate physical exam metrics to check in on things are our Slack growth. So, are we having new developers and new users come into the Slack? That tells me a few good things, right? It means it's discoverable. It means they're engaged enough that they care. And it means that the community itself is growing. And that's kind of a crucial kind of top of funnel thing. I look at things like new contributors, right? Which can tell us whether or not we're being discovered in the right orbits from an open source perspective, and whether or not our documentation, our onboarding, our first issues are good enough that they're, welcoming to new contributors. That's a key thing. I certainly look at kind of retention, right? And figuring out like where are we suddenly losing people's interest or enthusiasm, or where are they dropping off, and figuring out why. And it's not always like a science, right? It's sometimes a bit of detective work. But that kind of retention piece is key, is figuring out like, are you doing the things that kind of keep people interested and excited? And there's a few kind of proxy measures I use for that, sometimes things as simple as like our posts on Slack getting a lot of emoji responses, like our huddles on Zoom, like having good registration levels, or people sharing it on Twitter, like that. Those are good proxy signals for engagement. And then with our power users or enterprise users, like how quickly are they responding to us when we, check in with them? Those kind of things are really key. But in our stage of the game, I'm very focused certainly on kind of like top of funnel things, for lack of less businessy phrases, where it's like how much visibility are we getting, and how consistently, and how much is that translating into clones? How much is it translating into new Slack users? I used to pay quite close attention to stars, but I think what I've found, which maybe is not such a unique experience, is our growth in the first 4 months really corresponded to the star growth, right? We went from 100 to 1,000 stars on launch week. And then we gradually kept building towards 2,000. And I could say from the outside, from the inside, it felt to me like our growth corresponded to that chart. But since then, our kind of stars have somewhat, plateaued. But the good news is that our growth has like gone on a skyrocket since. And I just think that's an interesting point, which is to say that I'd love for our stars to keep growing, and I'm sure they will. But that it stopped becoming kind of a useful measure around 3 or 4 months in.
Our whole job as an OSPO, and I'm part of the Amazon Software Builder Experience organization, our whole job is to make building software at Amazon a really delightful experience, and reduce all of the friction and the toil and the difficulties that builders experience with tools and other friction. And open source compliance and open source questions can introduce friction and slowness, right? And it disrupts your flow. So one of the big metrics that I look at is how can we reduce the tickets that developers have to file in order to get approval of licenses. That should be approved, and we should really kind of automate it in our build and flow systems so that developers don't have to be disrupted there. And then we are also looking at how can we simplify and auto-approve simple contributions, simple releases, simple distributions, so that they never have to come and file a ticket and spend weeks with us, trying to get everything approved. So our answer is, how can we get developers to really go off and innovate without, speed bumps? That's one big metric. And then my colleague on the marketing side, David Nelly and team, often measure things like the health of projects that we host, health of projects that we contribute to and we are dependent upon. They spend a lot of time supporting developers on GitHub sponsors, and they give a lot of cloud credit. So they keep track of a lot of those kinds of things. How engaged are we? How are we working in community? What projects do we want to support and help, and things of that nature.
Many such things like DB ranking and our traffic and all of those. There are such metrics, and they are indirect and they help us. I also would go a lot with anecdotes, like what does my mom's cousin say about MariaDB? If she doesn't know what it is, well, that's a bad measure. That's a bad metric. If she says that she read about it here and there and know something about what it is, well, then it will probably have a brand recognition that helps. To give you a very serious and hard answer is looking at Jira and looking at GitHub. So looking at how those contributions grow and how they are being dealt with, and like votes on Jira items. That's a way for us to know what people really wish for. Not like those stars that come out of those. They absolutely help.
There is a lot we can look at and people have thought about looking at. And this is where it's really awesome that we have the Chaos project, because now we have one place where we can collect all of these ideas and build out resources around them. So in the Chaos project, I'll just start there, because if someone were to look for metrics, it's easiest to have a frame of reference that's already there and exists. And we have 5 focus areas of metrics, and they are around the value of a project, the risk in a project, the evolution of a project, diversity, equity, and inclusion in a project. So those are really high level categories that we have metrics in each of them. And then there are some generic ones where we just say, yes, there are different types of contributions, and we want to acknowledge all of them, because an open source project, like I said at the beginning, if it's only developers, we don't see the full picture of everything that is being done in open source, nor is it, there's a problem with overemphasizing the software development with metrics, because it's so easy to look at the log, the Git log, and all the commits that are made to edit the software. And we have the issues where, again, a lot of conversation is happening around contributions to the source code, bug reporting, feature requests. When it comes to like organizing events or helping newcomers and being on social media, it's much harder to have those kinds of metrics, but they're important to acknowledge. And so there are some ideas for how to do that, with encouraging everyone to like open an issue, say, hey, I did this. It doesn't really work that great. Sometimes it's just being in the community and recognizing those that we see every day and that have done awesome work in different ways, having the human component in that metric collection, if you want to call it that. It's really recognizing the contributors. But then you asked about not contributor-centric metrics. We can have metrics around, like risk is a huge topic that has gained a lot of attention in the last year, really, with SolarWinds, and ever since we had Heartbleed, where there is not just interest by users, companies, but now also government coming in and saying we need to regulate this somehow. And so metrics are starting to play a bigger role with test coverage and looking at who is contributing. Are there any contributors that are suspicious? And identities and trust in open source are becoming more and more like really hard to grasp and hard to put into metrics, but they're becoming more important.
Now, if you are running an open source business or a commercial entity, you may have been looking for funding, or you may in the future. So one of the things we've done at the Hacking Open Source Business podcast is invite investors to come talk about their perspective on open source and about building open source businesses. They have a unique perspective because they're looking at metrics from an investment perspective. So what sort of metrics do investors look for? Let's take a listen.
On the metrics side, we don't really look too much at metrics beyond the rate of growth. Like the rate of growth is probably the number one thing quantitatively. If the rate of growth is very slow over even a short period of time, whether it's weeks or months, that tends to make some impact on like that things could be less interesting. The rate of growth being, somewhere in the neighborhood of like 5 to 10% per week or 20, 30% per month. I have to say first, of all of our core investments, there was no pitch deck. And we engaged with the creators and the founders as humans before they conceptualized a deck and before they conceptualized the business. And so we in fact had to actually have a reasonable sense of conviction well before the creators themselves even had the conviction, which makes it even harder. And so by rate of growth, I more specifically refer to rate of growth of external contributors is something that really matters and is very interesting. Rate of growth of GitHub stars is probably one of the least interesting things because it's a very, very thin sense of sentiment and sort of popularity. It's not completely, lacking of some insight in terms of the proxy for, developer excitement or, diffusive interest. But I think that on its own, it doesn't give you a strong proxy for actual usage, actual adoption. I think Mitchell was actually just tweeting about this, the co-founder of HashiCorp, pretty recently. He used the physics analogy of potential energy and kinetic energy. And I believe he put the GitHub star metric in the potential energy bucket as opposed to the kinetic energy bucket, which is a very strong way of sort of categorizing and classifying different types of metrics. I'm not sure if he did this, but I would certainly put the contributor and the rate of growth of contributors in the kinetic energy bucket, meaning it's something more immediately visible in the sort of like immediate spectrum of stuff that affects the momentum of something, like from a physics perspective. I don't know, like other metrics that we look at are sort of the rate of the rate of development, execution, which frankly boils down to like the number of commits you're making into the repository on a monthly or weekly or daily basis. Like that's also very gameable. Like you could have a bot that's just like making small single line commit changes.
We're always, and especially now more than ever, right? If you're putting any type of budget towards like community and DevRel programs, like what is the ROI? It's such a tough one, right? It's like we're always trying to answer that. And right, there's metrics like the amount of activities, right? You can measure DevRel by like, okay, hey, this DevRel person wrote this many blog posts a week and spoke and responded to this many GitHub issues and Twitter, right? So it's like that's one, and then there's also kind of other metrics, okay, growth of like followers on Twitch and YouTube and your social media. Like at HashiCorp, kind of we at the end had a really large kind of DevRel community team, and kind of like our North Star was like the amount of traffic that we drove to our Learn platform, because it was self-serve, and so that to us was important, right? That the amount of people that were going and learning about our stuff was without us, because right, early days at HashiCorp, we were teaching trainings at all of our conferences. We were doing all those trainings, right? So imagine having an engineer and a DevRel person for a full day teaching 15 people. That doesn't scale. So that was kind of like the overall DevRel metric at HashiCorp. And then of course, each team had its own specific number of like tracking core contributor sentiment over time, tracking like ambassador engagement over time, tracking like Slack engagement or GitHub discussion. So there's various ways you can kind of look at like the health of the business. But it's a combination. And I always think like community is still part of kind of like your go-to-market and your marketing. So it's all of these touch points that help you convert potentially, right? Convert a person to a paying customer. So they attend a webinar, they get touched in some way, right? Through sales or DevRel. So it's all of it works in tandem.
The most important things are like the founders and why they're the best founders to go after a certain market and how big that market opportunity is. Like, can that market sustain a multi-billion-dollar company? And that's similar across both, though I would say for open source companies at pre-seed, oftentimes there might not even be a project that's out yet. It's really just an idea, a team. Maybe they've built things that are relevant before, or they just have learned to be experts in a certain domain or space. For seed, usually there is some open source traction if it's an open source company that we're looking at. And I'm looking for signals that will point, actually very much in line with the Series A metrics, that will point towards there being a market opportunity there. And so certain things I'm looking for are there like high quality users using that tool versus just hobbyists? And are users using that tool in production? Like, is it a project that is going to be meaningful? And so like my definition of production is if something breaks in the project, is it going to affect end user experiences?
Hope you've enjoyed this show and learned something about metrics and the different ways to measure open source communities and open source businesses. If you do, go ahead and like, subscribe, and follow us on YouTube. Come follow us on LinkedIn and anywhere you can get your favorite podcasts. We do appreciate you, and we hope that you enjoyed this show.